Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Homes of Hope Fiji podcast. I am your new host, Joshua Fatiaki, also field officer for Homes of Hope. And with me is Sue Taylor. Sue Taylor, welcome to the Homes of Fiji podcast. Just for the camera, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you.
Please. Yep.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everybody. My name's Sue Taylor, and I come from New Zealand. And I've been here with Homes of Hope for the last 2 weeks, just doing some training. My job is a trauma-informed care specialist, so I'm been here to help them learn more about how to respond and how to support people who have experienced trauma in their lives. And today I'd like to share a concept with you, an idea with you that I call generational trauma. And generational trauma is kind of just like it sounds. It's about how trauma or experiencing abuse and bad things in our life, very difficult situations, how the trauma from those events can be passed from one generation down to the next generation and on to the next generation and so on. Yeah. So, for example, if a person's grandparents had experienced some very difficult things, maybe they experienced the coup, or maybe they experienced political unrest or violence in the village, maybe they experienced physical violence, then it tends to impact how a person lives. Yeah. And so we find through research that the effects of trauma can be passed on to their children, and then when they grow up, it can be passed on to their children. So we can ask ourselves, why is it that those effects could be passed on? How is it possible? What they've found through research is that when people go through really difficult times, it causes their brain to become very stressed. Because in our brains, we have a stress response system, and it fires off when we're going through really tough times. And our brains tell our bodies to produce toxic stress or chemicals that go right through our body and can make us very on edge, so that we become very reactive. We're always scanning for danger. Yeah. We're always looking about somebody will harm me. And so our bodies become what we call overwired. There's too much going on in our brain. So when all this is going on, it can cause those people to be get very irritable with their children, or very reactive with their children, or on the other hand, it might be that they actually, because of all that's going on inside of them, they actually become withdrawn from their children because they can't cope with everything that's happening in their brain. They tend to neglect their children, not because they don't love them, but just because there's so much happening in their bodies that they tend to take a step back and isolate themselves from their children. And so the children don't experience that warm attachment. Sometimes because of the parents' own trauma, they turn to other substances like alcohol and drugs, smoking.
That's true.
That kind of thing. Yep. And that is to help them to be able to cope with all that's going on in here in their body. They have to reach out for something external to help them to take the pain away, to help them cope with those difficult emotions. And so, as you would expect, if you are using alcohol or drugs or something to help you cope, that's going to bring another lot of problems and complications into the family. And so trauma, the effects of trauma can be passed from one generation to another without us realizing. And I think, most people would say, that's the last thing I want to do. Yeah. I necessarily don't want to pass on those effects to my children and my grandchildren. They don't want that to happen, but these things happen not by choice, but just because you are learning to survive with what's happened, and think you pass on some of those effects without intention.
Without intention, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's just a little summary about what generational trauma is like.
Yeah. So I'd like to just ask this question to you, talking about generational trauma. So, because we see it here with all of the cases that we work with. Lots of people that we work with. A lot of them, when we ask them, they say, "Oh, because my mom was like this, or my mom's mom was like this,"
Yes.
And so it's not so much that it's passed down through the genes. And is it more self-inflicted?
They do say that research does show that it is passed on as well in the DNA.
Okay.
Because your DNA wiring has been changed as you have experienced the trauma and survived, then it can be actually passed on in your genes. But I think a large proportion of what is passed on is being through your behavior, the way you parent, the lack of responding, the lack of calmness and warmth within the family.
Yeah. Children
learn to survive.
That's right.
And to learn to have to cope with many changes, because maybe those first generation people, maybe they had a mental health issues, and so just were not able to. They could have had anxiety and depression and a post-trauma illness, and so they didn't do it deliberately, but because of their illness, their mental illness, and their use of all these substances to cope, then that affects the way that they can be good, caring parents.
That's very important. I think here in the Pacific, generational trauma happens, and it's become a norm for us here in the Pacific.
Right.
So, any recommendations on putting a stop to generational trauma? What do you think the first step would be?
Yeah.
The first step towards that direction?
I think that's just a really, really good question. And I think that the more we acknowledge that I have impacted my child in some way, or my trauma is causing a problem with my parenting, then we have to acknowledge it and own it. It's almost like we have to say, yeah, I put my hand up, I own that I've had a part in this.
Yeah.
And I want to change. And so I think the first step is actually owning it and saying, because of all that happened to me, the effects have then been passed on to my children, but I want to help stop this, because I don't want this little child to grow up and to pass it on to their children.
That's right.
It's like today we have to say it stops now. It stops with this generation. And we have to say we have to own our own trauma and what's happened to us and not pass it on. We want these little ones to grow up to be healthy, strong individuals. And we say it stops now, because we have to stop and acknowledge that, or it will be passed on again to the next generation and the next generation. And I think it's time we say, let's own it. Number one, we have to own it. Number two, I think we have to learn ways of actually, new ways of parenting and thinking about, what does my child need? And perhaps that means that we have to go to a little workshop or listen to some of the training that's in the village, and we have to say, well, how can I help my child to heal?
That's right.
Because, there is a saying that says, hurt people hurt people.
Hurt people.
But healed people heal people. So if we don't heal ourselves, we are then like hurt people. We will hurt those that we love. And so I think it's about acknowledging that and saying, You know, I've experienced lots of really difficult things in my life, and I've had trauma. And so I've done things that I wish I hadn't done, owning it.
Yeah.
Putting my hand up saying, yeah, that's me. I've done that.
That's right.
We can't change the past.
That's right.
But we can change the future.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's important for all our listeners out there. It's, you know, these recurring problems that you think, oh, because my family has been through it, I have to go through it. And you just heard it from Sutela, you know, take ownership, you know, just stand up for yourself and just say, what's done is done. I have to move forward. And yeah, I think this has been wonderful hearing from you, Sutela. And anything you'd like to add into that?
I mean, I think it takes courage to do this.
That's right.
And to put your hand up and say, I've made mistakes.
Yep.
It takes a lot of courage. But, you know, that's the first step. When you own it, then it's going to be easier every time you talk about it. And then you will see, you know, you can say to your children and be open and honest, and they will see you, hey, my grandmother's trying to really heal from the past. She's doing it. So she becomes the role model, the inspiration that we all need to do that. So, you know, we can have the ripple effect.
That's right.
We talked about the ripple effect in another previous video. And, you know, if someone says, yes, I own what I've done and I'm wanting change, that's the first step of the ripple. And then that can then help bring healing to the next lot, to their children and to their grandchildren. So it starts a positive ripple.
That's right. Yeah. And that's very important, that you make the change when you see that. And it all comes down to be more self-aware.
Yes.
You know, when you're self-aware, you know what's happening with you and the surroundings, and then you know what you need help in. And also, it's also good that you look for a good support group, people that will bring you up. Yes.
If we leave it with a quote, I don't know if you ever heard of Nelson Mandela, the famous South African president.
That's right.
A famous quote from him is, "Be the change you want to see in the world." We want things to change. We have to be that change.
That's right.
And as we be the change, we become change agents. So we can become change agents in our families to make a difference for our families. And we say, generational trauma stops today. We're not going to pass this on to our families. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sutela. Well, thank you for being on this podcast. It was good having you. I hope our listeners out there, you've learned a little bit of something. Please comment in the video. We'll get back to your comments. And till the next one. Later. That's good. Oh.